The bruise on my cheek had faded to a sickly yellow by the time I made my decision. 3 weeks had passed since that afternoon when everything changed, when the careful facade of family harmony crumbled in my living room while my 8-year-old daughter, Emma, watched from the doorway. I should have thrown them out that very day. Instead, I let them stay. My parents, Harold and Margaret Thompson, had arrived for what was supposed to be a 2-week visit to meet their granddaughter properly for the first time. We'd been estranged for years after I'd moved across the country, married David, and built a life they deemed beneath their standards. But when David died in a car accident 18 months ago, leaving me to raise Emma alone, I'd foolishly thought maybe grief could bridge the gap between us. I was wrong. The argument started over Emma's education. My parents had discovered I was sending her to the local public school rather than the prestigious private academy they'd researched and deemed appropriate for a Thompson. Their voices rose in my kitchen as I prepared lunch, their words cutting deeper than any blade. "You're failing that child," my mother declared, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against my worn countertop. "Living in this hovel, sending her to school with God knows what kind of children." "She's happy," I said quietly, focusing on spreading peanut butter on Emma's sandwich. "She has friends. She's learning." "Happy?" My father's voice boomed. "Happiness doesn't get you into Harvard, Sarah. Happiness doesn't secure a future." The familiar weight of their disappointment pressed down on me. The same suffocating feeling that had driven me to leave home at 18. But this time they weren't just attacking me. "Maybe if you hadn't married that mechanic," my mother continued, "if you'd listened to us about pursuing law school instead of that ridiculous art degree, you'd be in a position to provide properly for Emma." "David was a good man," I said, my voice barely controlled. "He loved Emma more than—" "He was beneath you," my father interrupted. "And now look where his love got you. A widow at 32, struggling to make ends meet in this suburban wasteland." That's when Emma appeared in the doorway, her small face pale as she clutched her stuffed rabbit. She'd heard everything. "Mommy," she whispered. Something snapped inside me. "Don't you dare speak about her father that way in front of her," I said, stepping between my parents and my daughter. "Don't you dare!" The blow came without warning. My father's hand struck my cheek with a crack that echoed through the kitchen. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my face as Emma screamed. "You will not raise your voice to us," my father said calmly, as if he hadn't just hit his own daughter in front of his granddaughter. "We are trying to help you, Sarah. To help Emma have the life she deserves." My mother's face showed no remorse, only cold satisfaction. "Perhaps now you'll listen." I looked at Emma, whose wide eyes were filled with tears and confusion, and something crystallized inside me. This wasn't about their disappointment in me anymore. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But instead of throwing them out, I smiled. "You're right," I said softly, pulling Emma close to me. "I'm sorry for raising my voice." Let me think about what you've said." My parents exchanged pleased glances. They thought they'd won. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. Over the next 3 weeks, I played the perfect penitent daughter. I listened to their criticisms with apparent humility. I let them reorganize my home, criticize my parenting, and make themselves comfortable in my guest room. All the while, I was planning. You see, my parents had built their lives on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. Harold Thompson, the respected investment banker, and Margaret Thompson, the socialite philanthropist, had cultivated an image of moral superiority and financial success that masked decades of questionable decisions and outright fraud. I knew because I'd grown up hearing the whispered phone calls, seeing the mysterious meetings, watching them destroy anyone who threatened their perfect facade. They'd raised me in that world, taught me to recognize the signs of corruption, even as they preached propriety. What they hadn't expected was that I'd learned to investigate, to document, to build cases. My art degree hadn't been my only education. I'd spent years as a freelance investigative researcher, helping lawyers and journalists uncover the truth behind corporate malfeasance. It was work I could do from home while raising Emma, work my parents dismissed as playing with computers. Now those skills would serve a different purpose. I started with their finances. My father's computer password was embarrassingly predictable: Emma's birthday combined with his mother's maiden name. Within hours, I had access to years of financial records that painted a very different picture than their carefully maintained public image. The embezzlement went back 15 years. Millions of dollars skimmed from client accounts, hidden in offshore investments, laundered through my mother's fake charity. They destroyed smaller investors, ruined retirement funds, and bankrupted trusts, all while maintaining their position as pillars of the community. But financial crimes weren't enough. I needed something more immediate, more personal. I found it in their correspondence. The emails between my mother and her sister revealed the truth about my grandfather's will. The family fortune I'd been told was lost to bad investments. They'd stolen it, forging documents and bribing lawyers to cut out my aunt, my cousins, and eventually, me. The money that had funded their lavish lifestyle for decades belonged to our entire family. But the most damning evidence was what I found about their other victims. The young woman who'd accused my father of assault 20 years ago. They'd silenced her with money and threats. The business partner who'd tried to expose their fraud, they'd destroyed his reputation and driven him to bankruptcy. The list of people they'd crushed to maintain their perfect life was staggering. As I compiled evidence, I watched them interact with Emma, and my resolve only strengthened. They treated her like a project, not a person. They criticized her drawings, corrected her posture, and spoke about her future as if she were a stock portfolio to be managed rather than a child to be loved. "She needs proper tutoring," my mother said one evening, watching Emma struggle with her homework at the kitchen table. "This public school education is clearly inadequate." "Her teacher says she's doing well," I replied mildly, continuing to prepare dinner while secretly recording the conversation on my phone. "Teachers at that school wouldn't recognize excellence if it slapped them," my father scoffed. "Emma, sit up straight. Slouching is a habit of the common classes." Emma's shoulders tensed, but she straightened obediently. The sight of my confident, joyful daughter shrinking under their criticism made my chest tight with rage. That night, after Emma was asleep, I made my first move. I started with an anonymous tip to the IRS, complete with detailed financial records showing the offshore accounts and suspicious transactions. Then I contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, providing evidence of the embezzlement and money laundering. But those were just the opening moves. The real game began when I reached out to their victims. Rebecca Martinez had been a family friend 20 years ago, a young woman who'd tried to expose my father's inappropriate behavior at his investment firm. They'd buried her accusations under threats and hush money, destroying her career in finance and forcing her to relocate across the country. She answered my call on the second ring. "Rebecca," I said, "this is Sarah Thompson, Harold and Margaret's daughter. I think it's time we talked." The silence stretched for a long moment before she spoke, her voice shaking. "I never thought, after all these years." "I have evidence," I said simply. "Emails, financial records, communications, showing exactly how they silenced you. Would you be willing to speak to investigators?" By the end of that conversation, Rebecca wasn't just willing, she was eager. She'd spent 20 years watching my father continue to hurt people, knowing she couldn't stop him without destroying herself in the process. Now, finally, she saw a chance for justice. One by one, I contacted their other victims. James Morrison, the business partner they'd framed for embezzlement while stealing millions from their joint venture. Linda Chen, the whistleblower they'd blackmailed into silence with fabricated evidence of professional misconduct. Thomas Wright, the journalist who'd gotten too close to their charity, fraud, and found himself facing a barrage of lawsuits that bankrupted him. Each conversation was the same: shock, then hope, then a fierce determination to finally tell their stories. While I built my case, my parents continued their campaign to improve Emma's life. They enrolled her in expensive piano lessons without asking me, hired a tutor to supplement her education, and began making noises about having her evaluated for boarding schools. "It's for the best," my mother said over breakfast, watching Emma pick at her organic steel-cut oats, another improvement they'd insisted upon. "She needs structure, discipline, proper influences." "I appreciate your concern," I said, buttering my toast with deliberate calm. "But I'm her mother." "Yes," my father said, not looking up from his financial newspaper, "and you've made your limitations in that role quite clear." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and I reached across the table to take her small hand. "Why don't you go get ready for school, sweetheart?" After she left, my parents launched into another lecture about my failures, about Emma's potential being wasted, about their duty as grandparents to intervene. I nodded and agreed, and let them believe they were wearing me down. They had no idea that 3 different federal agencies were now building cases against them based on evidence I'd provided. They didn't know that 7 of their victims had given detailed statements to investigators. They couldn't have imagined that the assets they thought were safely hidden offshore were being traced and frozen even as they criticized my choice of breakfast cereal. The first crack in their facade came on a Tuesday morning. My father's phone rang while he was reading his paper, and I watched his face change as he listened to the voice on the other end. "What do you mean, frozen?" he said, his carefully modulated voice rising. "On whose authority?" My mother looked up from her tablet, concern flickering across her features. She reached for her own phone, frowning when she saw 17 missed calls from their lawyer. I continued making Emma's lunch as chaos erupted around me. Phone calls were made, voices were raised, and slowly, the truth began to dawn on them. Their accounts were frozen, their assets were being seized, federal agents were requesting interviews. "This is impossible," my mother said, pacing the kitchen as she talked rapidly into her phone. "We've done nothing wrong." "Our records are immaculate." I almost smiled at that. Their records were indeed immaculate in documenting their crimes. "Sarah," my father said suddenly, his eyes sharp with suspicion, "has anyone contacted you? Asked questions about our family finances?" I looked up from wrapping Emma's sandwich, my expression carefully innocent. "No, why would they?" But he was studying me now, with the calculating gaze I remembered from childhood, the look that had terrified me into compliance for so many years. This time, it didn't work. "You've seemed different lately," he said slowly. "More agreeable." "It's unlike you to accept our guidance so readily." "I told you," I said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said, about Emma's future, about what's best for her," which was absolutely true. I had been thinking about Emma's future, a future free from their toxic influence, a future where she would never have to watch her mother be struck in her own kitchen or be made to feel ashamed of who she was. That afternoon, after Emma got home from school, 2 federal agents knocked on our door. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson?" The female agent showed her badge. "I'm Agent Rodriguez, and this is Agent Kim. We'd like to ask you some questions about your financial activities over the past 15 years. My parents' faces went white, but they recovered quickly, falling back on decades of practiced arrogance. "This is harassment," my father declared. "We demand to speak to our lawyer." "That's certainly your right," Agent Kim replied pleasantly. "But we have warrants for your arrest on charges of embezzlement, money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud. You can speak to your lawyer from federal detention." I pulled Emma close as we watched my parents being led away in handcuffs. My mother's perfect composure finally cracked as she was helped into the back of the unmarked car, her desperate eyes finding mine through the window. In that moment, she knew. I could see the realization dawn across her features, the understanding that their dutiful daughter had orchestrated their downfall. I felt no satisfaction, only a deep, weary sense of justice finally being served. The media circus that followed was intense but brief. The Financial Crimes Division's press conference revealed the scope of my parents' fraud: over $30 million stolen from clients, hidden through an elaborate network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The fake charity alone had diverted nearly $5 million in donations meant for children's cancer research. But the financial crimes were just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper, encouraged by the victims I'd helped come forward, more allegations surfaced: sexual harassment, blackmail, witness intimidation, decades of crimes hidden behind a veneer of respectability. Rebecca Martinez's testimony was devastating. She spoke about being a young analyst at my father's firm, about the inappropriate advances that escalated to assault, about the systematic campaign of intimidation that followed when she tried to report it. Her courage inspired others to come forward, women who had been silenced by threats and money for years. The trial made national news. The prosecution painted a picture of two people who had built their entire lives on exploitation and cruelty, who had used their position and wealth to hurt countless people with impunity. The defense tried to portray them as victims of a vindictive daughter's elaborate revenge scheme, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the verdicts came, guilty on all counts for both of them, I felt something inside me finally exhale. Harold Thompson was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Margaret Thompson received 18 years. Both would be well into their 70s before they had any chance of release. The civil suits came next. Every victim they'd silenced, every person they'd defrauded, every family they'd destroyed lined up to claim what they were owed. The lawyers estimated it would take years to sort through all the claims, but one thing was certain: my parents would never again have the power to hurt anyone. The family money they'd stolen was returned to its rightful heirs. My aunt called me, crying, when she received her portion of our grandfather's estate, money that should have put her children through college, money that could have saved her marriage when medical bills bankrupted them years ago. "I never thought I'd see justice," she whispered through tears. "How did you do it, Sarah? How did you find the strength?" I looked across the room at Emma, who was drawing at the kitchen table, her face peaceful and relaxed, in a way it hadn't been since my parents arrived. "I had to protect her," I said simply. "They wanted to turn her into someone like them, and I couldn't let that happen." The house felt different after they were gone, lighter, somehow. Emma's laughter returned, bright and uninhibited. She stopped flinching when adults spoke to her, stopped apologizing for taking up space. I watched her bloom back into the confident, joyful child she'd been before their visit, and I knew I'd made the right choice. People asked me why I'd waited 3 weeks to act, why I'd let them stay when I could have called the police that first day. The truth was complicated. Yes, I'd needed time to gather evidence, to build an unshakable case. But more than that, I'd needed to understand exactly how deep their corruption went, how many people they'd hurt over the years. If I'd simply pressed assault charges, They might have been convicted on a misdemeanor, paid a fine, and continued destroying lives. Instead, by taking the time to uncover the full extent of their crimes, I'd ensured they would never hurt anyone again. Some people called what I did revenge. I preferred to think of it as justice, long overdue. The assault that started it all, my father's hand striking my face while my daughter watched, had been the catalyst, but the real crime was decades of systematic cruelty. They had built their lives on the suffering of others, and I had simply made sure that suffering was finally acknowledged and accounted for. Emma and I went to visit David's grave on the anniversary of his death, a few months after the trials ended. As we placed fresh flowers on his headstone, she asked me about her grandparents. "Will they ever come back?" she said quietly. I knelt beside her, choosing my words carefully. "No, sweetheart. They made some very bad choices that hurt a lot of people, and now they have to face the consequences of those choices." She was quiet for a moment, tracing her father's name on the stone with her small finger. "I'm glad they're gone," she said finally. "They made you sad." "They made me many things," I said, pulling her close. "But they also helped me remember how strong I can be when I need to protect the people I love." As we walked back to the car, Emma's hand secure in mine, I thought about the choices we make and the prices we pay. My parents had chosen power and wealth over love and integrity, and it had cost them everything that mattered. They would spend their remaining years in prison, their reputation destroyed, their legacy one of shame and criminality. I had chosen justice over revenge, protection over revenge, and my daughter's future over my past. It hadn't been easy. The investigation had been exhausting, the trial emotionally draining, the media attention invasive and sometimes cruel. But watching Emma skip beside me, free and unafraid, I knew I would make the same choice again. They had assaulted me as my daughter watched. They had tried to break me, to remake me in their image of submission and compliance. Instead, they had awakened something in me that they should have feared, a mother's fierce love for her child, and an unshakable determination to protect her at any cost. I had let them stay just long enough to gather the evidence needed to destroy their lives completely. Not out of petty vengeance, but out of love for every person they might have hurt in the future, every child they might have corrupted, every family they might have destroyed. In the end, the greatest revenge was simply ensuring they could never hurt anyone again. And that, I knew, was something I could live with. The bruise on my cheek had healed completely, but the strength it had awakened in me would last forever. Emma and I were building a new life, free from their shadow, surrounded by people who loved us for who we were rather than who we might become. That was worth everything I'd sacrificed to achieve it. And as we drove home through the afternoon sunlight, Emma humming softly in her car seat, I finally felt at peace. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through the simple act of ensuring that the truth could no longer be hidden. My parents had taught me one final lesson, though not the one they'd intended. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is make sure that cruelty has consequences, that power cannot shield people from accountability forever. They had assaulted me as my daughter watched. Now they would spend the rest of their lives paying for that choice, and Emma would grow up knowing that her mother would always fight for her, no matter the cost.